Hi, I'm Janine,
This is Corey Jackson.
and today on Cart Logic, we're going to discuss an article that was released by the LA Times,
Mm.
and it discusses how young black men being killed by the police is one of the leading causes of death. So, Corey, did you get a chance to read the article?
Yeah, I was actually, I think that many African Americans wouldn't be surprised in this, right? We've been having a sounding board. One of the things that always comes to my mind is Chris Rock's famous quote during one of his interviews that just basically says, are African American men an endangered species, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he replied, well, no, they are not an endangered species because they're not protected by the law.
Well,
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea is that we see that data is starting to prove that unlike most groups in this nation, and certainly not those who are of European descent, we're starting to see that unlike those groups, that being killed by police is a leading cause of death.
Right.
For African American men between the ages of 25 and 29.
Yes. And so for those who may not have had a chance to read the article or didn't know it came out, a few data points. So about 1 in 1,000 black men and boys in America can expect to die in the hands of police. Mm-hmm. And also they're 2.5 times more likely than white men and boys to die during an encounter with cops.
Wow. I mean, think about this. Black men are more likely to die from a police altercation. That is above diabetes, influenza and pneumonia, chronic lower respiratory disease, and cerebrovascular disease, right? So that means there is only a few more things above that, right? Above getting killed by the police is things like cancer, HIV, heart disease, suicide, accidents, and assault.
And so one of the other points they talked about is that black men have better odds of being killed by police than they do of winning the lottery. But what I also found interesting, though, to make it a little broader, is for all young men, police violence was one of the leading causes of death between the years of 2013 and 2018. So that speaks to a larger issue, right?
Right. Many have discussed, and you see it all over the news, that maybe because we're just thinking that more black men are being killed because it's now being videotaped, right?
Right.
But the data is actually saying otherwise, that there actually is a higher rate of black men being killed by law enforcement than, say, winning the lottery and some of these other diseases that are killing other people at a higher rate.
So what do you think is going on, really? What is at the root of that? So why is this such an issue with police culture, this issue of violence? Because, right, the police force is not all white males. So what is going on there that we're seeing these alarming rates?
Right. I think the mistake that people make is that just because you are of the same race doesn't mean that you don't have racism.
This is true. So blue above all.
And so exactly, it's more of, it's not about the color of the skin about law enforcement. It's the career of law enforcement, right? So remember, all of these institutions of America, right? Their foundation, it was all built on advancing white people, right? And blocking everyone else. So if you think of, and that's, people call that institutional racism, right? So the fact that you are trained in a racist institution is what's causing you to do that. Not only that, you have internalized racism, right? Other black people could be scared of other black people too.
Right.
But I think even more, we have to understand why there is a historical distrust of law enforcement. And you have to do that, you have to go back at least 300 to 400 years, right? So if you think about it, when the Dred Scott case came about
Right.
in the 1800s, you began to see the Supreme Court saying that even if a slave went to a free state,
Mm-hmm.
they could still be caught and
Return.
taken and returned back
Right.
to slavery. Who were the ones that were sent to go and find these runaway slaves? Right? It is their version of law enforcement.
Right.
You keep going. You have the civil rights movement, the classic Pettus Bridge March, right, in Alabama, where John Lewis was helping to lead that march, where he was brutally beaten and he had a fractured skull after being attacked. And all they were doing was marching so that they can go to the registrar to register to vote. Who were the ones that were at the bridge stopping them?
Police.
It was police. So we need to understand law enforcement has nothing to do with justice or morality. Law enforcement has to do with enforcing the current laws that are on the book, whether they're racist or not. So the ones that were oppressing us and continue to oppress us because of racist laws is law enforcement. People need to understand that our greatest oppressors or enforcement for the oppressors is law enforcement. That's why there's a historical distrust and hate for law enforcement when it comes to African Americans. And I remember when the National Law Enforcement Convention or Conference was happening in San Diego.
Okay. And when was this? What year was this?
Oh man, it must have been maybe a couple of years ago. It was pretty recent. And the national president at the time actually apologized and said, yes, we have contributed to this because we were the ones that were enforcing these racial things.
Right.
So all of these things are important to understand why there's a natural tension and a natural distrust of one another. It is because racism was embedded in it from the very beginning.
So I know you read this week, right, about the officer being fired in the Eric Garner case. What were your thoughts around that? As you saw, his association, the police association, came out and said it was unfair for him to be fired and to lose his pension. And for them, that meant that they can no longer feel safe while they're doing their jobs.
My initial thought is, welcome to our world for African Americans, right? We've never felt safe around law enforcement. So maybe it'll help them to empathize when it comes to how do African Americans feel when law enforcement approaches us. But on a greater note, I believe that it's important that we continue to penalize law enforcement. We have to realize that for decades, police unions were able to implement protections in the law so that if they do kill people, they will not be penalized for it, right? So now we're starting to see those laws reversing. Just this week, California just passed its revision of use of force when it comes to engaging with individuals. So now in New York, the largest police force in the nation, policing the largest city in the nation, or the most populous city in the nation, that is, right? We're starting to see that we need to continue to make sure that we penalize law enforcement so that it stops being a current way of operating. We have to disrupt the status quo.
So, CART Logic, right? We're about action, not just talk. So what are some next steps for us citizens out there to make sure we keep undoing the way things have currently been done with the police force?
Number one, we need to start making sure that when we elect our elected officials, we specifically ask them, do you believe that the current laws protecting law enforcement are the right thing to do, right? And what is their plan to curb law enforcement? And the correct answer is not build stronger relationships between the community and the police, right?
Right.
That we need to stop fooling ourselves. Okay. Other studies are starting to show that more and more racist people are joining the police department because there is no test on whether someone is racist or not. So we have to be careful. We have to be vigilant. We have to make sure that we're just not satisfied with the progress that's being made now, but that we are pushing forward, right? Our job as CART is to push dignity and humanity forward. And so we must continue to make sure that the public is not satisfied, but that we continue to educate them on things that still can be done to make things better and to save more lives.
All right. Well, thank you. This wraps up an edition of CART Logic.
Thank you very much.